In 1943, when the first combat elements of the Tuskegee Airmen began arriving in the Mediterranean theater, the Luftwaffe barely noticed them. To German fighter pilots hardened by years of combat over Poland, France, Russia, and the Balkans, these newcomers were not a threat. They were a curiosity, an American experiment, a political gesture, something to be mocked rather than feared. Word spread among Jagdgeschwader units that the Americans had deployed an all-black fighter group. The nickname came quickly, cruelly, and confidently. Schwarze Vogelmenschen, the Black Birdmen. German pilots joked that Washington must be running out of real aviators, that the Americans were desperate, that these inexperienced flyers would break formation the moment a Bf-109 dove at them. Even within the U.S. Army Air Forces, many held doubts. The 33rd Fighter Group had fought tooth and nail to overcome stateside prejudice, fighting not only to learn to fly, but to be allowed to fight at all. Their training at Tuskegee Army Airfield had proven them skilled, disciplined, and determined, yet the Army still sent them overseas under the silent assumption they would struggle. But the German mockery, the snickering radio chatter, the dismissive intelligence briefs was something else entirely. Luftwaffe pilots believed that air combat was a realm reserved for the elite. They had spent years perfecting dogfighting techniques, mastering their Bf-109Gs and FW-190As, sharpening instincts born from the crucible of the Eastern Front. So when they learned that a group of African-American pilots would be escorting U.S. bombers out of North Africa and Italy, they dismissed the threat outright. To them, the Red Tails were not warriors, they were targets. But the German pilots did not yet understand the men they were mocking. They didn't know about the relentless discipline drilled into the Tuskegee Airmen during months of segregation-era training. They didn't know about the countless times those pilots were forced to fly perfectly because a single mistake would be blamed not on an individual, but on their entire race. They didn't know that 3/32's survival depended on proving every critic wrong. When the 33rd first entered combat from Ramitelli Airfield in early 1944, they were flying Curtiss P-40 Warhawks, aircraft inferior to the Bf-109 and FW-190 at altitude. Yet even then, the Germans began seeing something unexpected. These Black Birdmen held formation with iron discipline. They did not scatter when bounced. They responded as a unit. They protected each other, and above all, they protected the bombers. By mid-1944, the 33rd transitioned to P-47 Thunderbolts and then to the sleek, lethal P-51C and P-51D Mustangs, whose tails they painted crimson, a flourish that would become legend. The Luftwaffe saw those red tails for the first time with amused contempt. Easy to spot, some said, easier to kill. They had no idea that the aircraft carrying those red tails would soon become the most feared escort fighters in the skies of Southern Europe. In those opening months, the Germans continued to underestimate them. Luftwaffe pilots radioed each other when they spotted the distinctive crimson tails. Die Blacken are coming, watch them run. But instead of running, the Tuskegee Airmen did something no one expected. They stayed. They stayed when the bombers were attacked. They stayed when German fighters tried to lure them away. They stayed when other escort groups broke off to chase kills. The Red Tails, mocked as Schwarze Vogelmenschen, flew in tight formation directly above and around the American bomber groups and refused to leave them. This discipline confused the Germans. It irritated them. And then very quickly it began to frighten them. Because while Luftwaffe pilots were used to U.S. escort fighters diving after the first enemy they saw, the Black Birdmen did not take the bait. They held their positions, they waited, they protected. And when the Germans committed to an attack run against the slow-moving B-17s or B-24s, those same Black Birdmen descended on them with a precision and ferocity that the Luftwaffe had never anticipated from pilots they considered inferior. In the summer of 1944, word began spreading quietly among German units. Die roten Schwänze, sie kämpfen anders. The Red Tails, they fight differently. At first it was mere curiosity, then it became grudging respect, and soon as losses mounted, respect turned into apprehension. But at the dawn of 1944, during those first encounters, the Luftwaffe still clung to the old mockery. They still believed the nightmare's tide was far away. They had not yet seen the deadly accuracy of men like Lee Archer, Charles McGee, Roscoe Brown, or Robert Williams. They had not yet experienced the shock of their Me-262 jets being hunted successfully by red tails. They did not yet know that the men they mocked as black Birdmen would shoot down 112 enemy aircraft, cripple scores more, and develop a reputation as the most reliable bomber escorts in the entire U.S. 15th Air Force. The Germans did not know any of this yet. But they would. And when they finally realized what the Red Tails truly were, the mockery would evaporate, replaced by the sinking feeling that the Luftwaffe had just found its newest and most relentless nightmare. When the 332nd Fighter Group settled into combat operations from their dusty airfield at Ramitelli, Italy, the Luftwaffe still considered them an oddity, a novelty unit that would either crack under pressure or fade into irrelevance. But the Red Tails were already building a reputation inside the U.S. Army Air Forces that quietly contradicted every stereotype, every prejudice, and every whispered assumption about their abilities. They did not yet have the sleek P-51s that would one day make them legends. They began with rugged P-40 Warhawks and later P-47 Thunderbolts. These aircraft demanded meticulous flying, sharp judgment, and disciplined teamwork, qualities the Tuskegee Airmen had spent years honing under the most intense scrutiny any American fighter group ever faced. From the moment they arrived in theater, the men of the 33rd Fighter Group understood something crucial. Every bomber crew they escorted, every interception they flew, every maneuver they executed would be judged not only as individual combat actions, but as proof of whether African Americans could serve as fighter pilots at all. Mistakes that other squadrons brushed aside would become condemnation for the entire group. The Red Tails responded the only way they knew how, with discipline so tight it bordered on unbreakable. Their philosophy became legendary. While other escort units broke formation to chase German fighters for personal victory, the 33rd Fighter Group developed and enforced a rule that bomber crews would later immortalize: stay with the bombers, always. This doctrine was not glamorous. It meant turning down easy kills. It meant resisting the temptation to pursue a fleeing Bf-109 or FW-190. It meant swallowing pride and remembering that the bomber stream mattered more than the scoreboard. But it also meant that for the first time, an American escort group consistently did exactly what bomber crews begged for. They stayed. And that discipline did something no one expected. It saved lives. Early missions over the Balkans and the Po Valley introduced the Luftwaffe to this new fighting style. German pilots, expecting the usual chaos of American escorts scattering in pursuit of kills, instead saw tight protective formations that refused to take the bait. A group of P-47s or early P-51Cs with red tails would remain directly above the bombers, watching, waiting, forcing the German pilots to expose themselves if they wanted a clear attack run. Again and again, the Luftwaffe tried diving at the bombers, certain the escorts would break and chase. Again and again, the escorts held their line. This unnerved the Germans. They had trained for years to exploit American recklessness, counting on escort fighters to abandon their charges. But the Red Tails were not reckless. They were methodical, patient, and precise. As the 33rd transitioned fully to P-51C Mustangs and later to P-51D Red Tails, their combat performance surged. The Mustangs' long range allowed them to accompany 15th Air Force bomber streams deep into Austrian, Hungarian, Romanian, and German airspace, missions that stretched across hundreds of miles of hostile territory. The Red Tails quickly earned a reputation among bomber crews of the 461st, 484th, 5th Bomb Wing, and others. Word spread in the mess halls and briefing tents. If you see Red Tails above you, you'll get home. Those boys don't leave you. They're the best escorts in the 15th. Bomber crews began calling them red-tailed angels. But the Luftwaffe were slower to understand what was happening. At first, their intelligence officers dismissed the Red Tails as overly cautious pilots too scared to chase kills. But pilots in the field, the men facing the Red Tails over Linz, Vienna, Munich, and Ploiești, knew better. They saw a kind of teamwork unusual among American escorts. They saw discipline that denied them easy openings. They saw a group that refused to fracture under pressure, even when attacked from multiple angles. And then they saw something even more dangerous. The Red Tails were getting better, fast. Every mission sharpened their instincts. Every bomber formation they escorted tightened their coordination. Every German attack forced them to refine their tactics. They learned when to break formation and when not to. They learned how to time intercepts perfectly. They learned how to engage without exposing the bombers to secondary attacks. By the summer of 1944, the Luftwaffe had begun whispering among themselves a new sentiment. These Schwarze Vogelmenschen were not the joke they once seemed. In fact, they were becoming one of the most dangerous escort groups in the entire Mediterranean and Eastern European air war. But the Luftwaffe still did not know the full truth. They had not yet seen the kill tallies rise. They had not yet witnessed the Red Tails chasing down FW-190s with ruthless accuracy or breaking up coordinated attacks on bomber formations with surgical timing. And they had not yet watched the Red Tails engage and destroy the pride of the Luftwaffe, the Me-262 jet. That moment was coming, and it would erase the last traces of mockery forever. By the late summer of 1944, the Luftwaffe no longer laughed when they saw red tails. The mockery, Schwarze Vogelmenschen, the jeers about inferior flyers, the dismissive comments about American desperation began to evaporate as German pilots ran into a hard and undeniable truth. The Red Tails were not only competent, not only disciplined, they were exceptionally dangerous. And they were getting deadlier with every mission. Luftwaffe intelligence analysts initially assumed the Red Tails' growing reputation was Allied propaganda, some morale-building fiction crafted for bomber crews. But reconnaissance photos and pilot debriefings told a different story. The Germans were losing aircraft, Bf-109Gs, FW-190As, Ju-88s, not just to American escort fighters in general, but specifically to the 332nd Fighter Group. Losses were mounting in sectors where the Red Tails operated, especially over Austria and Hungary, and their combat reports were uncomfortably precise. The Red Tails were writing their names into the Luftwaffe's kill records. One of the first dramatic moments came in July 1944, when Lieutenant Charles Hall, already battle-hardened since flying P-40s, scored a series of kills against German fighters attempting to hit a bomber formation over Italy. His accuracy and calm under pressure shattered the belief that the Red Tails were timid or second-rate. German pilots who survived that engagement reported that the Black Birdmen held formation until the perfect split second, then broke with explosive precision to strike the attacking fighters, leaving no gaps in the bomber screen. But the 332nd's rise to legend began in earnest when they switched entirely to the P-51 Mustang. With its speed, climb rate, range, and handling, the Red Tails unlocked their full potential. They no longer had to worry about their aircraft being inferior to the Germans. Now the Luftwaffe was facing equal machinery flown by pilots who treated every second in the sky as a test of their worth. Among the Germans, a new name began circulating with frustrated respect: Lee Archer. The man they once dismissed became one of the most feared pilots in the Mediterranean theater. Archer's tally climbed quickly as he used disciplined pursuit and flawless marksmanship to take down multiple Bf-109s and FW-190s. Luftwaffe pilots assigned to intercept bomber formations escorted by the Red Tails began warning newcomers. Watch for the Red Tails. If they stay tight, you will not reach the bombers. But the moment that shook the Luftwaffe's confidence most violently came in March 1945 during the now legendary escort mission to Berlin. Bomber crews of the 15th Air Force braced for the arrival of the Me-262 jet fighters from JG-7, the most advanced operational aircraft in the world. The Me-262 could outrun and outclimb any piston engine fighter the Allies possessed.
Even the most experienced American and British units struggled to catch the jets during their slashing attack runs. The Luftwaffe believed, with justification, that the Me-262 was untouchable in the hands of a skilled pilot. But they were wrong. The Red Tails had studied jet attack patterns for months. They knew the Me-262 was vulnerable during takeoff, landing, and wide turning arcs. And on March 24, 1945, they proved it. As a formation of Me-262s slashed toward the bombers, Lieutenant Roscoe Brown from the 100th Fighter Squadron executed a perfect, high-speed intercept, swinging behind a jet during its turn and firing a controlled burst that sent it spiraling into the ground. Lieutenant Charles A. Train Brantley scored another Me-262 kill that same day, with a methodical approach that stunned German observers on the ground. A third Me-262 fell to the guns of Lieutenant Earl Lane. 3 Me-262s, destroyed by the very men the Luftwaffe had once ridiculed. After that mission, German pilots stopped joking entirely. In their debriefings, Luftwaffe survivors described the Red Tails with phrases never used before for American escorts: coordinated, disciplined, precise, unshakable, and most tellingly, dangerous. By war's end, the 332nd Fighter Group had accumulated 112 confirmed aerial victories, including Bf-109s, FW-190s, Ju-88s, enemy transports, and the prized Me-262 jets. The Germans who once mocked them now openly feared encountering those red vertical stabilizers in the sky. Their discipline had not made them cautious, it had made them lethal. For the Luftwaffe, the shock was profound. The pilots they had dismissed as unworthy opponents, pilots they had derided as black birdmen, had become the very adversaries they least wanted to see diving at them from altitude. The Red Tails weren't just disproving prejudice, they were dismantling it, with gunfire and precision flying over the heart of the Reich. The mockery was gone. The fear had taken its place.
By the closing months of 1944, the Red Tails had become a phenomenon across the entire 15th Air Force. Their reputation was no longer something whispered among bomber crews or grudgingly acknowledged by American commanders. It had become an operational fact, a strategic asset that began shaping how missions were planned. Yet for the Luftwaffe, this shift was far more than an inconvenience. It was a battlefield crisis. Everywhere the 332nd Fighter Group appeared, in the skies above Italy, Austria, Hungary, the Balkans, and eventually deep inside Germany, the Luftwaffe found itself facing a kind of escort fighter they were neither prepared for nor equipped to counter. These pilots did not fly like the others. They did not break formation for personal glory. They did not fall for bait. They did not fracture when attacked from multiple angles. And worst of all, they did not yield the bombers under any circumstances. The Red Tails proved their worth repeatedly during escorts to Ploiești, the oil fields whose destruction crippled German fuel production. German fighters defending Ploiești typically relied on aggressive dives and coordinated multi-plane slashing attacks to break bomber formations. But when the bombers were escorted by the 332nd, those attacks met walls of disciplined resistance. Red Tails kept altitude advantage, repelled the first wave, and then sliced into the second wave with devastating timing. Luftwaffe pilots reported their frustration. They did not chase, they waited for us. And when German fighters committed to a high-speed pass on the bombers, the Red Tails struck from above or from the rear with strikes so fast that many FW-190s never had time to disengage. The 332nd also proved lethal over Budapest and Vienna, where Luftwaffe defenses were still fierce in late 1944. These regions were protected by experienced Gruppen whose pilots had fought in the East, the Mediterranean, and over Germany itself. But even they struggled.
Tuskegee airmen would hold formation until the bombers were threatened, then break with perfect coordination, peel into pursuit, and eliminate attackers without leaving the bombers naked. This was a level of tactical discipline rare in any air force by 1944, especially in escort groups accustomed to chasing enemy fighters for personal victory tallies. In battles over Munich, Linz, and Regensburg, the Red Tails cemented their status as the most reliable escorts in the theater. Luftwaffe pilots described them as the red-tailed guardians above the bombers, a phrase meant with equal parts frustration and respect. The Tuskegee squadrons, 99th, 100th, 301st, and 302nd Fighter Squadrons, developed a rotating coverage system, weaving above and through the bomber formations so that German fighters approaching from any angle would encounter one or more P-51s ready to intercept. Several German pilots noted that, when the Red Tails were present, the bombers could not be reached without paying a price. One of the most devastating displays of Red Tail effectiveness came during the raids against rail yards and industrial targets around northern Italy, where the Luftwaffe attempted to intercept from low cloud cover. The Tuskegee airmen recognized the pattern and positioned themselves above the cloud breaks, ready to dive on the Germans the moment they emerged. This tactic resulted in multiple kills in mere minutes, and German intelligence officers were forced to acknowledge, begrudgingly, that these pilots were operating with a level of situational awareness that rivaled elite units like JG-27 and JG-53. The Luftwaffe also faced strategic consequences. Every bomber that the Red Tails protected survived to drop its payload. Every payload that landed on German or Axis factories, rail lines, oil plants, or troop concentrations accelerated the collapse of the Third Reich. The 332nd did not just defeat fighters, they disrupted Germany's entire war machine. Pilots from the 15th Air Force began requesting the Red Tails specifically. Crews flying out of Foggia and later Amendola airfields often breathed audible sighs of relief during pre-mission briefings when they learned the Red Tails would be overhead. Bomber losses on Red Tail escorted missions fell dramatically compared to other groups. Although the old myth claimed they never lost a bomber, the historically accurate reality is equally impressive. Their bomber loss rates were among the lowest of any escort wing in the Mediterranean, a record achieved through relentless focus on the mission's purpose, not the pilot's personal score. German pilots, once who joked about the Schwarze Vogelmännchen, now gritted their teeth when they spotted the distinctive crimson tails. The color that once inspired mockery had become a warning. It signaled that this bomber formation would not be easy prey. It signaled that the escorts above were not merely competent, they were exceptional. It signaled that the Luftwaffe would bleed if it pressed the attack. In the cockpit of their Bf-109Gs and FW-190As, seasoned German aces could only watch in frustration as Red Tails conducted perfectly timed diving intercepts or slid behind them with frightening precision. Luftwaffe reports began to describe the Red Tails with terms once reserved for elite Allied units, like the 4th Fighter Group or the RAF's veteran squadrons: coordinated, disciplined, skilled, and dangerous. The transformation was complete. The men once mocked as black birdmen had become, through ruthless training, tactical brilliance, and iron discipline, one of the most formidable fighter groups in the European theater. But the greatest shock for the Luftwaffe, the final humiliation, had already happened. The Red Tails had proved they could defeat the Me-262, and by early 1945, the Luftwaffe's veterans were forced to accept the truth. These pilots were no joke. These pilots were no experiment. These pilots were a nightmare. The last thing any German aviator wanted to see emerging from the sun or dropping from altitude with Red Tails flashing behind them. By the spring of 1945, as the Third Reich collapsed under the weight of Allied armies and a shattered Luftwaffe, the pilots who once mocked the Tuskegee Airmen were forced to confront a truth far more painful than defeat itself. The Schwarze Vogelmännchen they had ridiculed, dismissed, and underestimated had become one of the most feared, respected, and effective fighter groups in the entire European air war. The Luftwaffe, an air force that had produced icons like Galland, Marseille, and Hartmann, had been humbled by men they once refused to treat as equals. The German pilots who survived described it bluntly in post-war interrogations. "We did not expect them. They were better than we believed, much better." As 1945 progressed, the 33rd Fighter Group's record had become undeniable. Across more than 200 escort missions, they delivered some of the lowest bomber loss rates in the entire 15th Air Force. In a strategic bombing campaign where losing dozens of bombers on a single raid was common, the presence of red tails meant survival. They bled for it, they fought for it, and they earned a reputation so strong that bomber crews began demanding them by name, something no other escort unit achieved to the same degree. When airmen saw red tails above their formations, a kind of collective tension broke. The bombers' waist gunners, radio men, and bombardiers would point up and murmur the same phrase, "We're going home today." Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe's fear grew. The German fighters who once tried to slash through bomber formations near Vienna or Munich now hesitated when they saw the crimson tails closing in from altitude. They knew the red tails would not break formation early. They knew the red tails wouldn't be lured away by feints. And they knew that if they tried to attack the bombers, they would be intercepted fast, aggressively, and with coordinated precision. That fear crystallized after March 24, 1945, the day the Red Tails shot down 3 Me-262 jets during a single mission to Berlin. No propaganda, no myth. This was the official combat record recorded by both American and German sources. That day, the Luftwaffe's most advanced machines, flown by its most experienced pilots, were shot down by the very squadron they once mocked as inferior. The German commanders knew what that meant. If the Me-262 could not break the Red Tails, then the war in the air was truly lost. When the war ended, the Red Tails returned home expecting acclaim. Instead, many were met with segregation, discrimination, and the cold reminder that their heroism in Europe did not shield them from racism in America. But their combat record spoke for itself, and history would not forget. Their legacy became undeniable. 112 confirmed enemy aircraft destroyed, nearly 300 enemy aircraft damaged or destroyed on the ground. Distinguished Unit Citation for the mission to Berlin, one of the highest mission reliability rates in the entire United States Army Air Forces, a bomber loss rate so low that historians still study their tactics today. Most importantly, they shattered the myth that ability, discipline, intelligence, and courage belonged to only one race alone. The Luftwaffe's own reports admitted it plainly. The Red Tails' discipline was unmatched. Their formation integrity was unnerving. Their patience was lethal. Their timing was impeccable. They were the last escorts any German pilot wanted to face in the final year of the war. For the Red Tails themselves, men like Roscoe Brown, Charles McGee, Lee Archer, Daniel Chappie James, and Alexander Jefferson, the war became something larger than aerial combat. It became proof that they were as capable as any men who ever flew. Proof that segregation and prejudice had no place in military aviation. Proof that skill and courage were not bound by color. In interviews decades later, even former Luftwaffe pilots spoke with respect about the Red Tails. Some admitted they had no idea they were fighting an all-black unit until long after the war. Others recalled with unease how the Red Tails appeared whenever they tried to penetrate bomber formations, but all agreed on one thing. The men they once mocked had become their most relentless adversaries. That transformation, from scorned outsiders to elite fighter pilots feared by Germany's best, is what made the Red Tails legendary. Their red-painted tails signaled not just identity, but excellence.
They proved themselves in the skies of Ploiești, Vienna, Munich, Linz, Budapest, and Berlin, and they did it while carrying the weight of an entire nation's prejudice on their shoulders. The Luftwaffe never laughed at them again. History would never either.